Greetings, everyone. My name's Mitch Densley with the Palo Alto Networks Education Delivery Department, and today I'm here to show you a tutorial on how to set up multi-factor authentication within a Palo Alto Networks firewall using Okta. The first thing we're going to do in the Okta Portal is create a user and enroll them, as well as add an application and assign that user to that application. Then we're going to make note of several key components, namely the API address, a secret token, and our particular organization's subdomain, and I'll show you how to find those. Next, we'll take a capture of the Okta certificates that are running on the Okta Portal, as well as the root certificates above that Okta certificate. We'll import those into our firewall. Then we'll create a captive portal certificate, which we'll use later to set up the captive portal window and how to secure traffic from users to that captive portal window for the purposes of authentication. Then we'll create a certificate profile containing those Okta certificates we imported earlier. Next, we'll create an authentication server profile for multi-factor that contains Okta. Next, we'll create an SSL TLS service profile with that captive profile or captive portal certificate. Then we'll create a user in the firewall matching the same username and password that was created in the Okta portal. Now, if you're using Active Directory in more of an enterprise environment, you probably wouldn't create local user accounts like I'm going to do in this tutorial. You would reference via LDAP Active Directory accounts or some other directory of users, which the firewall can reference, and then also those user accounts can be added into the Okta portal. Next, we'll create an authentication profile, and we'll add Okta as an MFA factor. Then, when the user ID section, we'll set up our captive portal settings, which would contain the SSL TLS service profile we created earlier, as well as the authentication profile, and then we'll set up redirect. Now, Captive Portal supports two different modes, one being transparent, the other being redirect. Redirect you would use if users' traffic is coming from layer 3 interfaces. Transparent you would use if users' traffic is coming across a layer 2 or a virtual wire interface. However, Captive Portal multi-factor authentication is not supported in transparent mode, only redirect mode, so keep that in mind as you're designing this. Next, we'll make sure the interface that the user traffic is coming in on has response pages turned on in an interface management profile. We'll enable user ID on the zone that has the user's traffic coming into the firewall. We'll create an authentication object. Then we'll create an authentication policy rule referencing that object, and then we'll test it out. To set the stage here, I want you to see this network diagram. Essentially, we have a firewall in the middle, a user on the left, and the user wants to browse to a server inside of our DMZ. However, this server does not have secure authentication. It's just HTTP. So we're going to perform authentication step up using the firewall to force the user to browse over SSL, and that's where the redirect comes in, then authenticate first to the firewall. The firewall then will issue the user a multi-factor challenge. It will pass that to the Okta servers. The Okta servers then forward that to the user's mobile device. The user satisfies the challenge on the mobile device. Okta then sends the firewall back the go-ahead, and the user's traffic is then redirected through the firewall to the native address of the server in the DMZ the user was trying to go to. All right, here we are in the Okta portal. Now, I'm not going to be able to show you everything there is to know about this portal, but I am going to hit a couple highlights. First thing I want to do is add an application. And the application we're going to look for is called Okta Verify. Now, this stage it wants to assign some users, but I'm going to do that later. So I'm just going to next. Now under directory, I'm going to go to people, and I'm going to add a user or a person. And I want to send the activation email, and I'll save. Next, I can open up that account and assign this person to the Okta Verify application. One thing I also forgot to do, I want to assign this user to a particular group called test users. Now, under security, you've got several things you could set up. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to scroll through it really quickly so you can kind of see how I've got mine set up currently. Now I have created an MFA test policy for my test users, which is now active, which because it's based on a group and my user I just created belongs to this group, it's now applicable to that person as well. And this will be a nice way for us to test that the multi-factor authentication push is working when the user tries to log into the Okta portal. And we'll do this long before we actually set up the multi-factor authentication in the Palo Alto Networks firewall, just to make sure that the client and the push and the mobile app are all working as we expect, just to rule out any potential problems. All right, next what we want to do is come down here to the multi-factor section. All right, we see we've got Okta Verify enabled and the push notification. And under multi-factor policies, we have an MFA auth policy for Okta Verify with push assigned to my test users. Now, one thing I do want to change here is this rule. I'm going to edit it and make it so that the user is enrolled in multi-factor the first time they sign into Okta. All right, now under security, we're going to come down here to API and then tokens. And we're going to create a token that authenticates the Palo Alto Networks firewall as it talks to the Okta portal. Also, we need to record our URL to the Okta portal. I'll just save this here. And then the subdomain is basically going to be this everything right up until Okta, whatever it is. So that's mine. And the token, let's create that now. And we'll copy this token down. You only get to see the token once. So put it someplace secure so you can add it later. Before we check the user, I want to do one more thing, and I want to capture the certificates above this Okta portal here. So since I'm using Chrome, I have to hit F12. And then over under security, I'm going to view certificate. And here I can see this particular certificate. I'm going to copy it to file. Palo Alto Networks requires certificates be in base 64 encoding. I'm going to put this in my downloads, Okta certs folder, and we'll call this okta.com. Next, I'm going to come to certification path, select the intermediate certificate. We'll do the same thing. And then one more time for the root. All right, let's see what our user received. Okay, so our user got an email from Okta. We'll activate the user's account. Create a password. All right, after creating the user's password and putting in a security question, we're prompted to set up multi-factor authentication based on that rule we had set up earlier. So I want to configure my factor. I've already got my device type selected, and I've already downloaded the Okta Verify app. So I'm just going to click Next. All right, and I don't have the ability to scan the barcode. So I want it to send me an activation link via email. And then I'll just go back to my email. Click on this link here. which then enrolls my device. All right, once you see this all counting down, that means everything is pretty much set up right. So let's test it, shall we? Okay, I'll send the push and then approve. And I'm logged in. So this confirms that we have our user created, the user has their mobile device set up properly, and the push is working properly. So now let's move over and configure the Palo Alto Networks firewall to do the multi-factor authentication push. Okay, so we've logged into the Palo Alto Networks firewall now, and the first thing we want to do is import those certificates from Okta. So I'm going to come in and click import. We're going to call this the okta.com certificate. We'll browse for it. And then click OK. We're going to import now the intermediate. And then lastly, we'll import the root. All right, when you see the three kind of laid out like this, we know we're in a good state. The next thing we need to do is generate a certificate to be used for our captive portal. So I'll call this my CP-cert. The common name could be either an IP address of the traffic interface that your users would be browsing through, or it could be a DNS name. I'm going to use an IP address just to keep things simple. Now, because this will be a self-signed certificate, I would click Certificate Authority. However, in an enterprise environment, if you have your own PKI, it would be strongly encouraged that you instead generate a certificate signing request, then export that CSR, have a certificate generated based on the CSR by your PKI or your certificate authority person, and then re-import that certificate matching the exact same name to marry up the private key, which will only be stored in the firewall, with the certificate generated by your external authority. But for now, I'm just going to keep this simple as certificate authority. Next thing I want to do, we can add some different attributes if we want, really just to help users understand, who's responsible for the certificate, where it came from. One thing to keep in mind, hostname and IP are subject alternate names. So if you put in a DNS name here, you can always populate the IP as well, to make sure that the URL, the address the users are browsing to, matches either the subject alternate name or the common name of the certificate. For now, I'm going to leave these blank and simply hit generate. All right, now that's been created. The next thing I want to create is a certificate profile that contains those DigiCert certificates. So I'm going to call this simply Okta Certs, and then add in both of those two, DigiCert root and DigiCert intermediate. Now there's a lot of settings you can apply here. However, I'm going for simplest just for this tutorial, so that's sufficient. The next thing I want to do is use that captive portal certificate I created, and I'll put this into an SSL TLS service profile, which we'll call this CP-TLS. And the certificate we choose is going to be our CP cert. And then we could specify a higher TLS version if we want, but I'm just going to keep it simple. Click OK. Next, we're going to scroll down. In the server profiles section, you'll see multi-factor authentication. We're going to click Add here, and we're going to call this our Okta MFA. We're going to reference the Okta Cert certificate profile we created, and then this will be of the Okta adaptive type. Now it's asking for an API host. We recorded this earlier as URL. So we copy that. Then our token. Then the subdomain. And I can click OK. Now we're going to add the user account to the firewall. In an enterprise environment, you would probably be better off to reference Active Directory accounts via LDAP and add that in via the LDAP server profile, then create an authentication profile referencing this LDAP profile. However, I'm going to keep things simple and use merely local accounts. And I'm going to make this local account match the account name I created within Okta. However, notice I can only use a simple username. I can't use the full email address or UPN username. So I'm just going to do what I can, which is that. Match the password. Click OK. Next, I'm going to come up and create an authentication profile. This will reference our local database. I'm going to call this Okta Auth. Under factors, we're going to check this new box, enable additional factors. And we're going to add in our Okta MFA that we created earlier. We'll go to advanced and then add in that operator or that firewall operator user we created just a moment ago and click OK. Next, let's go set up our captive portal. Under user identification, captive portal, we'll click the gear here. We'll reference first off our SSL TLS service profile we created earlier, the authentication profile we just created. Now we have two options of mode, transparent or redirect. Transparent is only useful for layer 2 traffic or vWire traffic. However, multi-factor authentication will not work for the transparent mode at this time. So for multi-factor authentication, we must use redirect and then provide a firewall interface IP address to redirect the users to satisfy the authentication challenge, and then they'll be redirected back to their intended destination. So I'm going to put in the same IP address that matches my captive portal certificate's common name. I'll click OK. Then I'm going to come over to the network tab, and this IP address you see matches here Ethernet 1.2. This is where the user is going to be coming from. I have to assign an interface management profile to this interface, and this interface management profile must have response pages turned on. For future troubleshooting simplicity, I'm also going to add ping, so we'll call this ping_RSP for response pages. Click OK. All right, now you see also that this interface is assigned to my trust zone. So the zone of trust must have enable user identification turned on. Click OK. We're nearly there. Next, I'm going to come over to Objects, scroll down, find the Authentication Object, add in a new Authentication Enforcement profile. We'll call this Okta MFA-web form. And we're going to reference that authentication profile we created earlier, and the authentication method in this case is going to be a web form. We'll click OK. The last thing we do is go to Policies. We're going to scroll down until we see Authentication Policy, and we're going to create a policy to perform authentication step up to our DMZ server. So we'll call this auth step up for DMZ server. And this is going to be for traffic coming from my trust zone, going to my DMZ zone. And the traffic, I could specify service HTTP or HTTPS or add in additional services. However, I'm going to keep it simple and leave it as just service HTTP because the server in question only supports HTTP and we want to perform secure authentication before the user gets to that. So we'll click Actions now, and under Authentication Enforcement, we're going to choose our Okta MFA web form. Click OK and commit. Next thing to do is to test it all out. All right, our commit is finished, so let's test it. Here I've got my client. Just going to open a browser, go to the website in question. Notice we get redirected to the interface address on the firewall. Since we're using a self-signed certificate, the browser doesn't trust it, but if you generated one using your corporate PKI, that would hopefully be trusted. Now we'll authenticate as firewall operator, provide our password. Secondary authentication in progress. There's the prompt to authenticate. I approve. And there we go. The remote system did connect as we expected, and our mobile device helped us authenticate. So just to recap the steps, we create and enroll a user in the Okta portal. Then we, within Okta, add an application and assign a user. We record the API address, secret token, as well as my subdomain. Export the Okta certificates to a folder and then import them into the Palo Alto Networks firewall. Create a captive portal certificate. Create a certificate profile containing the Okta certificates. Then create a multi-factor authentication server profile. Create an SSL TLS profile for the captive portal certificate. Create and add a user inside of the firewall. Create an authentication profile and add Okta MFA as the factor for that authentication profile. Set up the captive portal, essentially secure the traffic using the SSL TLS profile, which contains the captive portal certificate we created earlier. Reference the authentication profile we created earlier. Set it up to redirect so that the user's traffic goes to their nearest firewall interface. Make sure that that particular interface has response pages turned on. Enable user ID on the zone where the traffic is coming into. Create an authentication object with the action of web form. Then create an authentication policy to match the traffic, and then reference that authentication object we created, and then test it. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.